Today we're going to start with our first main paradigm, and we're beginning right at the beginning. We're beginning with the early church. This period is not simply one paradigm, though. There's actually multiple kind of micro paradigms or micro shifts that are occurring through this period. And so we're kind of going to address the first 500 years of Christianity, if I can borrow Latourrette's term. The first thing we need to see is the characteristics of the Jewish mission. And so things start in Acts in Jerusalem. And so as the apostles are going about, they were told to go from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, to the ends of the earth. This was the Great Commission. But the reality is that everyone stayed huddled up in Jerusalem. And they focused primarily on Jews. It wasn't till later where it says, and then, these people who went to Antioch, they also didn't just speak to Jews, they spoke to Greeks as well. But at this point, the idea was that the gospel was Jewish. I think in today's world, there's this big question of, can a Jew follow Christ? But back then, the question was, can a Gentile follow Christ? And so the focus of the early Christian mission was predominantly on Jews. Part of their message, according to Bosch, was that they focused on the apocalyptic return of Christ, the imminent return of Christ. And you can see this being addressed through Paul's letters, where into the Thessalonian church, people are not working and they're kind of taking handouts because they're thinking, well, Christ is coming back at any moment, maybe today. And so there was this expectancy of his return immediately. And because of this, there was a kind of fiery passion behind what they were doing. As things continued, the very first shift that we see is the gospel goes from being a primarily Jewish thing to also focusing on the Gentile world. And so the second thing we're going to look at is the characteristics of the Acts post-Jerusalem mission. And so this post-Jerusalem mission is the gospel spreading out. And the first thing we see is that this post-Jerusalem mission embraced the Gentile mission. So you see the apostles crossing boundaries. Now they left the Jewish world. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the globalization paradigm. But they left the Jewish world because of persecution. So God caused, or allowed to be caused, this diaspora movement of diaspora Christians to now spread throughout the Near Eastern world. And they started going throughout the world, and they went as far as Antioch. Now, there's two Antiochs. Most of you are probably familiar with the Antioch in Turkey and maybe associated with Turkey, but the Antioch that they went to was actually the one that is in modern-day Syria. And so the one in Turkey is a relatively small place. The one in Syria, large, cosmopolitan city, right on the crossroads of some major highways back then. And because of this, you see the very first conflict. We talked about the difference of paradigms, how one paradigm views the same information from the other paradigm, and kind of wires get crossed, so to speak. And they get crossed over this issue of circumcision and the law for people who are from a non-Jewish background. And there was a whole group of people who believed that if you were from a non-Jewish background, that it's great that you have Jesus. Now that you have Jesus, let us give you the full bestowment, and that includes circumcision, and that includes, by extension, adoption of the law. And so they have this council in Jerusalem. Now, we're going to bring up the Jerusalem Council a number of times throughout the course because it's a very pivotal moment for multiple topics. And so particularly when we talk about the global church, there's so many lessons that we're going to pull out of the Jerusalem Council. But one of the things that we see is that the Jerusalem Council is evidence that they were embracing the mission to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And so the early evangelists are reporting, just as we heard and received gifts of the Holy Spirit, so also our Gentile brothers now have received the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And so what else can we do but welcome them in? So first thing we see is embracing the Gentile mission. Second, embracing cross-cultural missions. They are pushing out into different thought forms. So look at the early sermons in Acts, the sermon at Pentecost that kind of begins with our father Abraham, and it goes through Jewish history. Fast forward and compare that one to Acts 17, where Paul is standing on Mars Hill. And he starts with this high cosmological view of God who made everything in it is not made by human hands, neither is he worshipped. But he kind of used a launch pad of this idol to the unknown God to get him to that point. And so, two very, very different sermons, very different ways of reasoning. Now, many people who see Paul and think about this numerically, which that's their paradigm, is to think, well, numbers equal success. They think, well, the early sermons of Paul in these other places, these were successful based on the number of people. And his one in Acts, when he goes all philosophical, is not successful because it's fewer people. I would argue both are successful. He did what God had called him to do in both places. But the contexts were different. When you're preaching to an all-Jewish audience that already understands the Jewish paradigm, that already understands the Old Testament and the Messianic prophecies, to go into their world and to open up the Old Testament and to show them how Jesus is the Christ. And this was Paul's method. We see Paul going from city to city and starting in the synagogue first. Even if his main ministry switches to working with Gentiles, his main ministry started with the synagogue every single place that he went. And so it's one thing to compare coming from a kind of, I use the word Bible background, but he's talking to some Bible backgrounded people. Now he's way out of Kansas and he's talking to people who have no Bible background. Their background is utter paganism. And so it's just a very different cultural context that he's working in. We see them embrace a cross-linguistic mission. You saw this in the early church where they were choosing Greek-speaking deacons to minister to the Greek-speaking widows. And so we see early on the first churches were these mixed multitudes, these gathered multitudes of people from different language backgrounds. And so it was important to have people who spoke their language minister to them. We can also see, so that'd be an example where they got it right. We can see where Paul gets it wrong. And sometimes Paul does get it wrong. So I would say Paul is infallible in what he speaks in terms of Scripture, but in terms of everything he does, he's human like you and I are. And Paul himself admits that he does things wrong. So one of the things that I would point to is in Acts 14. They're in Lystra, and this is the place where the people offer a sacrifice to them at the end of them coming and preaching. And this was because there was a historic moment, or at least a myth rather, that Zeus and Hermes had come to that city before and were received, or were not received hospitably except for one elderly couple. And because of this, they cursed the town and they flooded it. Everyone but the old elderly couple drowned, and this elderly couple, their house is now the site for the new temple. Well, they thought, we're not going to make that mistake again, and so they offer sacrifices to them. And in the text, in Acts 14, it says, and they switched into Lycaonian when they said, Zeus and Hermes have come down to us. So they see the event, and now they're going to interpret the meaning. What does this mean for us? So Paul comes in speaking the trade language. They're speaking another language, a different language, in terms of their heart language. And so in interpreting meaning, they weren't doing it in the trade language for them. They were doing it in their heart language. And so you can see where Paul, at the end of the story, is barely holding them back from offering these sacrifices. But part of it is it's cross-linguistic. And so that makes it, that adds another challenge for them. I think sometimes people portray Paul in this kind of triumphal way. And I don't think that's how Paul would portray himself. I think when we see in his letter to the Corinthians in particular, and other places as well, where he talks about how they have suffered for the gospel. I don't think Paul has that same triumphal air about him. Michael Duncan wrote an article called "The Other Side of Paul," and he might overstate his claim a little bit, but let me just read it to you. He says, "It would almost seem as though Paul's early years produced little fruit. He had an incredible ministry, yes, but we must not read the current, he calls it, heresy of triumphalism back into his life. In Paul's life and ministry, he had a theology of failure, Duncan says. He says, Paul's ministry grew out of the soil of wilderness years, painful theological debate, ruptured friendship, spoiled church growth, numerous hardships, and dubious project success. Despite the setbacks, though, Paul could look back on all the failure, pain, and hardships and still conclude that he had been running in the grandest run of all. One of the things that's very common for me to question is this era of triumphalism. And so when I see the same kind of thing in Scripture, I think it's very important to highlight that this sort of modern Western view that everything's just on this this kind of evolutionary upswing and everything's just going to get better and better and more effective, I think we have to challenge that. And I think when we start talking about the colonial era and the post-colonial reaction to the colonial era, you're going to see how, globally speaking, while many progress reports are exciting, and I'm excited about these too, in many other ways, missions is becoming more and more difficult to do as we go forward. At the same time, God is still God, and there's many opportunities in the world for us to continue to have effective missions. But in order for us to do this now in the face of conflict and political upheaval, we also need a really deep spirituality of despair, of being able to go through the wilderness and come out on the other side. And so I think understanding that secondary lesson, yes, we see Paul having certain highlights, but we also see in Acts and in the other writings of Paul that there are these other dark moments where things are not fitting kind of our American model of, man, we're going to go and we're just going to overcome and it's going to be great. Probably all of you have had a really dark time in your life where you come into church and all the music is, happy, rah, and you're not feeling it. And it's almost alienating because you think, man, I'm in despair right now, but I just must be a bad person because look at everybody else. They're all jazzed about this. I think there is a theology of despair. And so, I realize I'm pulling from the Old Testament here, but when we look back to the time of the exile, there's so much in terms of spirituality that becomes applicable for us as we think of mission in the modern world. And so mission in the modern world is very akin to the exile that the Jews went through. And so we can learn a lot of lessons there. So the second main shift, we talked about the first shift. So we started with the Jewish mission, the post-Jerusalem mission, as the apostles went out. Now we're going to talk about the post-apostolic mission. And so what I mean by that is after the book of Acts has ended. This is kind of the second major shift. So still in this Acts mission, there's a high degree of Jesus is coming back and it's going to be soon, and that kind of apocalyptic message is certainly strong. But as things shift, as the political powers change, as Christ's return tarries, as it waits, they start settling in an uneasy kind of way to the world as they knew it then. So one of the divides that, just to set up the context here, that's dividing this world at this time, is there's a bit of language distance. As the church has become, for them, global, there are Eastern and there are Western languages. There are Eastern and there are Western ways of thinking. In seminary, we often study Greek, and if we study a Semitic language, we study Hebrew. I'm indebted to Kenneth Bailey and many of his books where he gets into the Arab side of the church fathers. And in fact, he argues that seminary should include Arabic studies programs, not just Greek and Hebrew, because he says, well, the early church, many of the leaders were in the Arab world. So Paul goes to Damascus right after his salvation experience, and he works with the church there. We saw at the time of Pentecost that there were people from Arabia there. And so there's the other side of the Middle Eastern world that we don't really hear much from, even though it's had a strong and historic church. We only know it kind of through the modern lens, which is these are Muslim countries, but they were Christian countries before they were Muslim countries. And a lot of people don't really know that. But this feeds into some of the debates that they were having back then. I don't want to oversimplify and say it was just linguistic differences, but language is not just a difference in words. Language is sometimes a difference in how you even think about something. And so just think of how precise or imprecise languages can be. Think of the difference between Greek and Latin, which have very precise tenses, versus Aramaic or Arabic, which, even though they might have the precise tenses, they don't necessarily use them operationally on the street in the same way. I was studying Arabic a while ago, and we had a German speaker who was in class with us. And of course, Germans are known for their precision and their exactness. And the German language is a very large language with lots of precision and exactness. And she was baffled one day by our Egyptian teacher. Now Egyptian Arabic is, or just Arab culture in general, tends to be much less precise, much more about feeling than about action. And so the Arabic teacher, she was talking about a time frame for the next class the next day, and she used two Arabic words. One is hawali. Hawali means about or sort of or kind of, and then the other word is bizabt. Bizabt means exactly. So what time are we meeting tomorrow? Hawali bizabt 11. About exactly 11. To which our German classmate goes, no, you can't do this. There's no about exactly 11. It's either exactly 11 or it's about 11, but it can't be about exactly 11. And so she wasn't just objecting to the translation of the words. She's objecting to conceptually that you cannot conceptualize time in a non-German way for her. But you can. This woman was doing it. And it wasn't so much expressing the exact time as it demonstrates how does she even see the issue in particular. So this is going to come out in the life of several of these debates, where there's one group of people that have a much higher comfortability, much higher comfort with mystery, and another side that has, I would say, a God-given gift of precision. And when these two people sit down and talk, they look like heretics to each other. That's not to minimize the actual differences that are there. I'm aware of that. But there are some cultural factors at play. Another characteristic of the post-apostolic mission is confrontation with paganism and idolatry. So paganism, it's not just about being a false religion. Its very nature and tone was very eclectic and very syncretizing. So when I talk about syncretism, we mean just the blending of beliefs. There was no idea that it should be exclusive, partly because none of their gods were considered to be absolute. We call the Greeks or the Romans polytheists. Technically, they are henotheists. So polytheist is belief in many gods. Henotheist is also the belief in many gods, but it's regional divinities. And so this is why when you would go to one place or another place, you would venerate that deity, even if it was not your deity, because you are in his or her sphere, and you don't want to tick them off while you're in their sphere. And so you do things to garner their blessing and support while you're there, even if you have another household god. Christianity obviously is much different. Our narrative is that there is only one God. He is the creator and sustainer of everything, and he is the way, the truth, and the life. And this was the message that Christians were going into in a world that was diametrically opposed to it. This sounds a little bit like our day. But paganism was one of the major things that they were confronting. So the mission to the Jews was not about confronting idolatry and false gods, as they were not into that kind of thing. It was about proving that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah. But as they are now off in the Greco-Roman world, they definitely have to confront this. The second confrontation they have is with heresy. Heresies have arisen. Even in the time of Paul, you see him addressing certain particular pet heresies that now are growing and growing and growing into movements. Gnosticism is one of the major ones, and so this one stresses secret knowledge. It stresses that matter is evil. And between these two ideas, this corrupts. One, it was trying to make religion a very knowledge-based thing rather than a practice-based thing. But two, with matter being evil, this causes huge questions on the person of Christ. Can Christ be fully human if matter is evil? And so different Christian camps that were in some way buying into or reacting against this were forced into positions that were later shown to be wrong. Irenaeus, who's writing at about this time period, he has a book called Against Heresies, and if you ever read it or flip through it, he just lists them out one after another, after another, after another. And so there were many, many people at this time who were writing these very weighty books where they're calling out all kinds of heresies. You have certain church councils that are happening around this time. You have the Council of Nicaea, 325, or the Council of Chalcedon in 433. And in both of these cases, they're answering some kind of objection to the person of Christ, his nature, his being. And so there's a strong confrontation with heresy now as Christianity has taken some kind of root, and now schools of thought are developing. And so the church is having to weigh these schools of thought against each other. Then finally, there's confrontation with the empire. This lands, the weight of this burden lands on Christians at the time. And so persecution was a major element. At this point, Christianity was an illicit religion. So if Rome would conquer an area, they would grant that area could practice the religions that were in existence. But this was essentially a no new religions policy. Well, Christianity counted as a new religion. And so it was being persecuted at this time. It was persecuted in Jerusalem from the Jewish side, but now that they've gone to the Greco-Roman world, they're likewise being persecuted. The church in the West, not too long after this, though, was given a bit of a reprieve politically in the Edict of Milan, which this allowed Christianity to be tolerated. And then about 10 years later, Christianity became the state religion. And so if you think about the mission to Jerusalem, to the Jews in Jerusalem, it's very apocalyptic. Jesus is coming back, kind of a bit of fire and brimstone to it. Well, now it's several hundred years later, and we just received official recognition, and now we're the state religion. So there's kind of, they've got a front yard that they've got to maintain, basically. And so this becomes kind of the struggle now of the church, is to adapt to how do we become an official thing. Bosch says, what began in primitive Christianity as a bold confession in the face of the emperor cult that Jesus was Lord, ended in a compromise where the emperor was to rule in time and Christ was to rule in eternity. And so the early Christians would kind of thumb their nose to the emperor when they would confess Jesus is Lord, because the confession of allegiance to Caesar was Caesar is Lord. And so that's the early confession, is we're going to thumb our nose. Well, now the church has official recognition. And so in order to receive recognition, they also have to play ball. They also have to play nice. And in playing nice, Bosch is saying they're kind of conceding their message of immediacy by saying, okay, Caesar rules, the emperor rules in time, in our time. And we kind of have paradoxically, but Christ rules eternally. And so that's how they settled this out. Some of the main characters of this time, the first of these would be Polycarp. Polycarp was an apostle of John. There's some people who've questioned this a little bit, but I think I'm okay with it. If this does hold true, Polycarp represents the last living link between the eyewitness apostles and the rest of the missionary movement that came from him. Polycarp was a very effective witness. He combated both heretical groups, but he also combated paganism and idolatry. In fact, he combated paganism and idolatry so strongly that he was accused of being an atheist for his anti-paganism preaching. And so because he rejected all of their gods, they assume, well, you believe in no God. Obviously not the truth. As persecution grew, the empire sought to capture him, and they tortured one of his followers and found him hiding in the barn. He was an old man at this point, 86 years old. And when they captured him, they didn't really want to kill him because he's an older gentleman. They don't really gain anything by, making a spectacle of an old man. And so they compel him to recant his faith. And this is what he says to them. He says, "For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" And so being true to their word, he was burnt at the stake, and he was kind of the first martyr of his era. Patrick was another one of these main characters. So Polycarp kind of bookends us on one side. Patrick would bookend us on the other side. He was taken captive in his teens, and he became a believer in captivity. He was raised in a Christian home, but according to himself, he was not a believer at that time. He is kind of known for, I hate to use the word eccentric, but eccentric prayer life. And while praying one day, God gave him a vision that he was to go to this port town and hop on a boat, and that this would rescue him. And sure enough, he went to town and hopped on the boat, and he was able to escape that way. He found refuge back on the mainland at a monastery. And it was during this time in his monastery, he was not just receiving training, but he received another dream. And he compares this to his Macedonian call, where he sees someone from the tribe that he had been, from the town that he had been held in, asking him to come back. And so he went back. He met with a lot of resistance as he was preaching a pretty Roman message at that time. But one thing that he is very famous for was his ability to contextualize, to take the message, to take the essence of the message from one culture, pull it out, and implant it back in another culture. As we talk more about contextualization, or as you read in the readings as you go along, this can be a dicey topic for some people. And I want to encourage you that, as the missiologist Leslie Newbigin says, he says, the gospel is never culture bare. There is not this perfectly distilled, eternal word. You always see the gospel in culture, in language, in cultural clothing. And so this notion that there is this pure form out there and that we're going to find it is not true. It's always in a particular form. It started in a very Jewish form. It got put into a very Greek form, and on it goes. So after encountering stiff opposition, after learning to contextualize, he was very, very effective. He's credited with planting about 200 churches and leading an estimated about 100,000 people to Christ. Nestorius was another character from this time period. He was very famous to us today in theology classes because he was condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431. His condemnation was because he was not willing to call Mary the Mother of God. Because of this, he was banished to Egypt. His followers traveled after him to Egypt, and they went with him in exile there. He moved on from Egypt and went to Persia, and ultimately his followers made it as far as India and China. And so they planted churches everywhere they went. So many people actually compare the missionary movement of the Nestorians with the missionary movement of Patrick and the monks that came after him. They had a threefold system. This was kind of their missiology or their ecclesiology even. One was monasticism. They would build monasteries. Two was a practice and teaching of theology. And then number three was mission. And so this is why you saw them carrying the gospel so far. And so we're going to pause right there, and we're going to pick up in the second video.